If I had known the smell was coming from the basement, I might have left that house weeks ago. But I didn't. I stayed. And that's a decision I'll regret for the rest of my life. The first time I noticed the smell, it was faint, barely there. I figured it was just an old house smell, maybe from the carpet or the air ducts. It wasn't enough to bother me, so I ignored it. But after a week, it got worse. The smell was sour and sickly, like something decaying. It seemed strongest at night, which made it even harder to ignore. I checked everything I could think of, the fridge, the trash bins, under the sink, but nothing explained it. Then other things started happening. At first, it was little things. A cup in the sink I didn't remember using, a carton of milk in the fridge that seemed a little emptier than it should have been. I thought I was just being forgetful, moving too fast, distracted, but it kept happening. One morning, I woke up to find the pantry door open and a box of cereal left on the counter. Another time, a fork was left in the sink, even though I always run the dishwasher before bed. It didn't make sense, but I told myself I was imagining things. What else could it be? Then the smell got so bad I couldn't ignore it. It was suffocating now, clinging to the air and even my clothes. It got to the point where I started leaving windows open just to breathe. One night, I had friends over, hoping they'd distract me from my growing unease. But as soon as they walked in, they noticed it too. One of them asked what the smell was, covering their nose. I laughed nervously, blaming it on the old house. Another friend joked it was probably a dead animal somewhere, but her smile faded when she realized I wasn't laughing. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard a noise. Started as faint tapping, like dripping water, but then it turned into something else. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from the basement. I froze, straining to listen. The sound stopped after a few minutes, and I told myself it was just the old pipes creaking or my imagination running wild. But I didn't believe that anymore. The next morning, I locked the basement door, but that didn't solve the problem. The smell was worse than ever, and I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. I grabbed a flashlight, unlocked the door, and started down the creaky wooden stairs. The stench hit me like a punch in the face. I gagged, covering my nose, but I kept going. The flashlight beam wavered as I reached the bottom, scanning the room. That's when I saw it. In the far corner of the basement, there was a mattress. It was disgusting, stained and covered in dirt, surrounded by piles of clothes, food wrappers, and empty cans. It looked like someone had been living down there. But the mattress wasn't the worst part. Next to it, in neat, deliberate rows, were animal carcasses, cats, rabbits, even birds. Their bodies were lined up like some kind of sick display, their fur matted and stiff with decay. The smell was unbearable now, choking me as I tried not to vomit. Then I heard it. A creak came from the stairs. I spun around, flashlight shaking, but there was no one there. I didn't wait to find out if someone was hiding in the shadows. I ran up the stairs, slammed the door shut, and called the police. When they arrived, they searched the basement thoroughly. They found evidence that someone had been living there, sneaking into my house when I wasn't home, eating my food using my sink. And worse, they'd been killing animals and leaving their bodies as some kind of twisted collection. The police never caught the person, but I couldn't stay there any longer. I moved out the next day, leaving the house and everything that came with it behind. I still think about the sound of those footsteps at night and the rows of bodies in the basement. Sometimes, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gone down there at all. One thing's for sure, I'll never ignore a strange smell again. The house was supposed to be a fresh start, but I never imagined it would lead to one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. When my great-uncle passed away, I inherited his old house, a creaky two-story place that hadn't seen much care in years. I didn't know him well. He was one of those distant relatives you hear about at weddings and funerals but never actually meet. The house was more of a burden than a blessing, but I figured it was a chance to start over, so I moved in. The first week was uneventful. The place was musty and cluttered, but I spent my days cleaning out rooms, fixing squeaky doors, and sorting through his old things. The basement was the worst, dark, damp, and filled with boxes of stuff I had no use for. It wasn't until my second week that I started noticing odd things. First, it was small. A loaf of bread would be missing from the pantry, or I'd find a box of cereal moved to a different shelf. I assumed I was just being careless, moving things around and forgetting about it, but it kept happening. One morning, I found the fridge door slightly open, even though I always double-check it before bed. Then came the noises. Late at night, I'd hear faint creaks and taps, almost like footsteps. The house was old, so I chalked it up to the usual settling sounds. But one night, as I was lying in bed, I heard something new, something heavier. It was breathing. I froze. It was faint but unmistakable, like someone was just outside my bedroom door. I stayed still, listening until it stopped. The next morning, I convinced myself it was a dream or maybe the wind whistling through the drafty house. But the next night, it happened again. I decided to investigate. I checked the doors and windows to make sure everything was locked. I even went into the basement, thinking maybe a raccoon or stray animal had somehow gotten inside. I didn't find anything, but as I was organizing some boxes, I noticed something strange. In the corner of the basement, behind an old cabinet, was a small, narrow door I hadn't seen before. It wasn't marked, and it blended into the wall so well that it was easy to miss. Curious, I opened it. Behind the door was a crawlspace. The air was stale, and the space was cramped. But as I shone my flashlight inside, I saw something that made my stomach turn. There was a small mattress, stained and filthy, with a pile of blankets next to it. Empty food wrappers and cans were scattered around, along with a makeshift lantern and something else. Lying neatly on the floor were small wooden figurines. At first, I didn't think much of them, but as I picked one up, I realized how detailed they were. They depicted people, men, women, even children, and each one was frozen in a violent pose. One figurine showed a person holding a knife. Another depicted someone tied up. The carvings were crude but horrifying, and the more I looked, the worse it got. Then I saw one that made my blood run cold. It was me. The figurine was unmistakable. The details were too specific to ignore. The shirt I was wearing that day, the cut on my hand from opening a box, even the way my hair was parted. And the figurine wasn't just a likeness. It showed me lying face down, with what looked like a pool of blood carved beneath me. I dropped it and stumbled back, flashlight shaking in my hand. That's when I heard it. Breathing. It was coming from deeper inside the crawl space. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I ran out of the basement, slamming the door behind me. I called the police, barely able to get the words out. When they arrived, they searched the crawl space and found signs that someone had been living there for weeks, maybe months. They never caught the person, but the figurines were taken as evidence. I moved out the next day, leaving the house and everything inside it behind. To this day, I don't know who was hiding in that crawl space or how long they'd been watching me, but sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet room, I swear I can still hear that faint, heavy breathing. If you're drawn to tales like these, consider subscribing to Spectral for more chilling entries waiting to be uncovered. And if you have your own haunting story that you'd like featured in an upcoming compilation, we'd love to hear it. Just email us at spectralentries@gmail.com. Now, let's get back to the video. When we first rented the house, the basement was the least of our concerns. We were just happy to finally have a place big enough for all of us. But that door still haunts me. Started as a dream move for our family. The house was spacious, affordable, and in a quiet neighborhood, everything we were looking for. It was old, sure, but that just added to the charm. The basement, though, was a little unsettling. It was dark, musty, and had this heavy, rusted door at the far end. The door was padlocked, with chains wrapped tightly around it. Naturally, we asked the landlord about it before signing the lease. He dismissed it, saying it was just old storage, nothing to worry about. He added a quick reminder not to tamper with it. His tone was casual, but the request stuck with me. It was an odd detail, but we didn't think much of it at the time. We needed the house, and the rent was within our budget. We agreed and moved in. For the first couple of weeks, everything was fine. The kids loved their new rooms, and we were finally settling into a routine. The basement, however, remained untouched. Then the noises started. At first, it was faint, just soft, muffled thuds coming from behind the locked door. We thought it might be the pipes or maybe even rats. But as the days went on, the noises got harder to ignore. Late at night, there would be faint tapping, almost rhythmic, like someone gently knocking from the other side. My wife made light of it, suggesting the house was just getting used to us. But I could tell it was starting to bother her, too. One night, the kids came running into our room, frightened. They said they heard scraping noises coming from the basement. I grabbed a flashlight and went down to check, but the house was silent. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered. A week later, the curiosity got the better of us. The noises weren't going away, and we were tired of tiptoeing around the mystery. One Saturday afternoon, while the kids were at a friend's house, we decided to break the lock. It took some effort. The chains were old but solid, but eventually we got the door open. Behind it was a small, windowless room. It smelled stale, like it hadn't been opened in decades. And there, in the center of the room, was her. It was a mannequin, but it didn't look like any mannequin I'd ever seen. She was dressed in an old, yellowed wedding gown, with lace gloves and a veil that hung low over her face. Her features were eerily lifelike, too lifelike. Her eyes seemed to glisten under the dim light, and her lips were painted in a soft, unnatural pink. The room itself was bare, save for the mannequin. No boxes, no furniture, just her, standing perfectly still in the middle of the floor. At first, we laughed nervously, trying to make light of it. My wife speculated, half joking, that maybe the landlord was some kind of collector. Still, there was something deeply unsettling about the way the mannequin seemed to watch us, even though we knew it wasn't alive. We closed the door, replaced the lock, and tried to put it out of our minds. That's when things got worse. The next morning, I went down to check on the basement. The padlock was still in place, just as we'd left it. But when I opened the door to the room, the mannequin wasn't in the center anymore. She was closer to the door. I stood there, frozen, staring at her. The thought that someone had been in our house crossed my mind, but there were no signs of forced entry. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that she had been moved deliberately. Over the next few days, things spiraled. Every morning, when we checked the room, the mannequin had moved, just slightly but enough to notice. Once, her veil was lifted. Another time, her arm was raised. The footprints started showing up after that. They were faint but unmistakable, dusty impressions of bare feet, leading from the room to the basement stairs and back again. We tried locking the basement door, but it didn't help. Every night, the sounds continued. Muffled thuds, soft tapping, and something that almost sounded like breathing. One night, I stayed up, determined to catch whoever, or whatever, was messing with us. I sat at the top of the basement stairs, flashlight and bat in hand. At around 2 a.m., the footsteps started, slow and deliberate, moving up the stairs. I braced myself, gripping the bat tighter. But when the footsteps stopped, the door remained closed. I couldn't take it anymore. We packed up the next morning and left. The landlord didn't seem surprised when I told him we were breaking the lease. He didn't even ask for an explanation, just nodded with an understanding look. I'll never know what was really going on in that basement or why he was so insistent we leave that door alone. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that mannequin, those lifelike eyes, those footprints, and I wonder, was she ever just a mannequin?